I'm going to call up Chip Cutter from the Wall Street Journal. He's a reporter. You probably read a lot of his stories. And Emma Goldberg, who's a features writer at the New York Times. Come on up. These are two folks who, as writers, who I learned from. I really respect. I really admire both of you and the work that you're doing. We're going to speak for maybe about 10 minutes, just sort of go through what you both are seeing, and then we will actually save a few minutes for questions. So this is your big opportunity to ask questions of the journalists. And I think one other note is that both Emma and Chip, as journalists, have perspective across organizations. So we're all like in our own lane and own organization, and you just see across the organizations and what's going on. So thank you both for joining me here. I really appreciate it. I want to just start before we dive into the topics, and Emma, maybe we start with you. How did you start writing about work?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one thing that led me to be really excited writing about work is that it felt like this opportunity to draw a little bit from what everyone I knew experiences on a daily basis at a moment when we were all going through what felt like this completely unplanned experiment in like what happens if we kind of throw all the old rules of work out the door and make up something entirely new. So I started covering the workplace in 2021. And that was a moment when it truly felt like nobody knew what was going to happen, whether office culture was going to return in full force or whether it would return in some sort of entirely remade way. So it really felt, it's funny, before that I was covering science and health. And it actually felt in a funny way like I was continuing to cover experimentation and, studies, research. But the factors were all the people I knew, including my own work life. So it was almost like, a really hyper turbocharged version of what I'd been covering before.
The human laboratory of the workplace. Chip, exactly. How did you start writing about work?
Yeah, so I started even before the pandemic. Before I joined the Journal, I was an editor at LinkedIn. Yeah. So LinkedIn hired all these journalists to provide original news and analysis on top of the site. And so at some point at LinkedIn, I was sort of traveling the country and we were doing all these stories about sort of like what it was like to work and what were the issues at work. And so then got recruited out of there to the Journal. And so for me, it's been really interesting just to continue writing about work and to see how much it shifted. Yeah. I find it to be one of these great beats because you can write about absolutely anything, whether it's politics or culture and power, and so much is sort of there, these great human stories. So it continues to be a lot of fun.
I think, part of the story, it seems to me, is that there are pendulums in a bunch of different areas that feel like they're swinging. And I'd be interested to hear your views on which the most important ones are and where you're seeing them. And among the ones are worker power, flexibility, people-centered benefits and policies, which are one end and feel like they're swinging, cost savings and efficiency, strategic HR, AI is like, another one. And maybe we don't have a ton of time, but maybe Emma, of those, like what stand out for you and what are you paying closest attention to and seeing?
Worker power and the dynamics between workers and their employers is always of interest to me, in particular, kind of trying to separate the narratives that emerge on social media and what actually is represented in the data. I think one of the deepest demonstrations of that was there was a lot of narrative around the Great Resignation, like nobody wants to work anymore. Yeah. And when you actually parse the data on that, it seemed like there was an almost one-to-one correlation between people who were leaving jobs and taking new jobs that were better paid or more flexible. So I think I'm really interested in worker power from the perspective of actually like matching the narratives with the data and asking what's really going on in workers' lives.
And how would you say, where would you characterize where we're at now in terms of worker power and where is it trending?
I think that the pendulum has started to swing back a little bit from this, huge resurgence in worker power that we saw. I think the tech layoffs were a challenging moment for some of the workers who had, taken the opportunity to really state what sort of conditions they wanted at work. But I think that, that we still haven't seen those gains entirely eroded. It's just that I think there's been like a little bit of a resettling from what felt like this big upswing in workers demanding flexibility, demanding certain perks.
Yeah. Chip, of these, what do you focus on?
Yeah, I find it, worker power to me is fascinating always. I would also add like the efficiencies part of it. The amount of conversations I have with CEOs or HR chiefs and others just talking about how we're not done cutting. Like we have to think about sort of what, for every employee that remains, let's make sure that they're great. I mean, the idea that like performance management is back, and we're going to be tough. Like if we're going to have a person, they have to be exceptional. And so I'm interested in just sort of how companies go about that. Like where do they decide to cut? How they design an organization now with AI here? I think all of that could sort of create interesting stories.
And is your sense that there is continued focus on cutting efficiency? Yes.
Definitely.
Yes,
I mean, it really comes up almost in every conversation with the CEO, particularly those that aren't on the record when we're just having like on background conversations or whatever it is.
Yeah.
They just talk about how they're so sort of focused on this right now.
Oh, that's interesting. It's a little frightening, but yes, that's their preoccupation when they're talking to Chip. I want to ask you, you talk to lots of people and companies, and I'm just curious, like for both of you, what, or maybe Chip, you go first. Like, are there any companies or leaders who stand out for you, who you're interested in, kind of where things go?
Yeah, so I'm really intrigued by what's happening at Bayer, the big pharmaceutical company. We wrote a little bit about this earlier this year, but Bayer is going through this massive management experiment. They have a newish CEO who basically wants everybody to pick their own team every 90 days. So the idea would be, his view is that there's so much waste in corporate America. People do a lot of make work activities. They make a presentation that goes to another committee, that goes to another committee. And he just says that if peers were evaluating each other, if workers were deciding what really needed to be done every 90 days, companies would go a lot faster. They'd operate a lot differently. To me, this is kind of one of the most interesting experiments happening in work right now, and we'll see where it goes. I mean, there's still like big unanswered questions about even how people are paid, how they're evaluated. Like it's really like they're trying to work all that out still, and so I'm fascinated by that.
And it's like truly a radical experiment at scale in the public eye.
That's right.
Yeah. We're going to take questions in a minute, and we actually have a few folks with microphones over here. So if you want to raise your hand, if you want to ask, this is your time to ask questions of Chip and Emma. So don't miss this. Emma, I want to ask you the same question in terms of leaders and companies.
I'm fascinated to see how the Amazon 5 days a week back in the office RTO plan works out.
There's a rumble of
I think it's a question on a lot of people's minds, because it feels like in some ways a lot of other companies and CEOs are looking to Amazon to see how that works out for them. The day that memo came out, I was calling hybrid work experts, and some were saying that they expect to see workers resign or look for new jobs. But I think it's going to take a couple of months before we actually see how this shakes out, what enforcement looks like, how closely are they going to be checking badge swipes. And I think other companies and CEOs will look to that as a model. And that, what hybrid work experts have really emphasized to me is that the only constant for workers has been change. Everyone's seen their companies shift RTO policies several times. So I think if Amazon succeeds in getting back to 5 days a week, I think that could be really telling in terms of where other companies
go. Okay, do we have any questions? We have one.
I have one over here.
Okay, over here. Thank you. If you can keep them short, we want to let everybody go just as a thank you.
Okay, I'll keep it short.
Thank you so much.
Maker Canelo, founder and CEO of Ani. Quick question. When you look at where people are investing in from a leadership perspective in terms of return to office, which is workplace in general, where's the largest disconnect between leadership and employees in terms of their stated preferences?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I still think there's this idea among leaders that they're just employees are kind of slacking off, they're not working if they're at home, and we just need to be able to see them, whether that's if that gets back to sort of the way that leaders sort of rose through the ranks and what they're used to or what they're comfortable. To me, that's still the biggest disconnect when you talk to workers and what their experiences are versus what leaders are seeing. Yeah,
I completely agree. I would also add, I think when you look at every study that's been done on the effects of remote and hybrid work on productivity, the results are all over the map. Like there's been studies that show -18 productivity, +20 productivity. And I think the bottom line is that it really comes down to what the management policies look like. Like when workers come back into the office, do they understand why they're coming in? Are there intentional opportunities to collaborate or find mentorship? So I think a lot of people are looking for this kind of one answer on, does it help or hurt productivity to have people at home, when the reality is a lot mushier and much more dictated by the kind of intricacies of policy.
Raj Chowdhury from HBS this morning said he's seen excellent hybrid work, good hybrid work, and terrible hybrid work. And it depends on the company.
Yeah. And it's often then up to managers then to enforce all this. And we've talked to so many managers who say, for example, like some tech companies, they're getting like template emails sent to them from employee relations that, if some of their people didn't meet the return to office quota that month, they've got to send this template off to that. And then the managers are just rolling their eyes being like, this is too much. We don't want to do that. This feels, too aggressive.
Great. Do you have other questions back there? Yep.
So everyone in this room lives with the whiplash of your colleagues in the financial journalism realm saying that there's going to be a recession. And so then we have to respond to CEOs saying it's a recession. What conversations are you guys having with your peers to talk about those gaps? What's happening with the financial reporting and what are you guys seeing in the world of work reporting?
Yeah, the connection, the economic context, I guess, for the work reporting. Do you want to start it, Chip, and then
I mean, I think so much of it has been difficult, right? Like we've been sort of anticipating a recession for years and years and years now. And I think part of it is just HR chiefs trying to be close to their CEOs, trying to get a sense for like where the business really is and what we're seeing. I don't think I think still we're in this moment. Maybe it changes once we see bigger drops in interest rates, but I think there's still a lot of concern that we have to just be tight on expenses. We have to be careful about spending right now. I think that pendulum just keeps swinging back. I don't know.
Yeah. I've also, I tend to focus on speaking with workers and just trying to hear their experiences. And something I hear from so many people is just the additional stress, that this inflation puts on their lives, that cost puts on their lives, and how that factors into the return to office. People talk about the challenges of paying for commutes, paying for gas, paying for lunch and coffee. And so I think that from workers, I hear a real desire to have transparency with management and to be able to hear this kind of recognition of the economic pain people are feeling. So I think that workers really crave openness in conversation with their managers on, inflationary pressures and economic pressures. And so that's one kind of realm where I really see this playing out.
That's interesting. So employers actually engaging around the macro context that we're going to take a question over there.
Hi, Jody Gorenstein, Inspire Human Resources. On a similar note, this is a really, really tough job market. I'm speaking to so many great people who have been looking for a job for many, many months. So along the lines of what you were just saying, if you had your crystal ball, when do you think the market's going to open up? What encouragement can we provide to people?
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I don't know. I mean, we talked to a lot of smart people who have different views on when this is going to happen. We've been really intrigued by sort of what's happening, not only in the white collar job market, but sort of what's happening for hourly roles. We did a story a few weeks ago. I was at Boston's at Logan Airport, and there was a big sign on the door for the company that provides airport cleaners and the people who push wheelchairs. And he had a big sign on the door, like, not hiring, like, we don't need anybody. And that to me was a signal, like, these have been sort of the hardest jobs to fill. Like, Boston's a high cost city. These are hourly roles. And they're like, we're good. We don't need anyone. So we're interested in just sort of like, what that looks like. It's still, from all the signs that we have, still seems like it's softening. But the jobs report looks really strong the other day. So I think it's hard to kind of get a sense for where we really are.
Yeah, and I am glad you brought up the recent jobs report because I think that there were positive signals. And nobody has a crystal ball, but I speak a lot with the kind of youngest people in the labor market in particular. And I hear from them like a lot of uncertainty and instability and fear, both around like the current conditions of the labor market, but also just the uncertainty in a more macro sense about what could be coming up ahead. They hear regularly that there are certain jobs that could be quickly going extinct because of generative AI. I think people who use ChatGPT and generative AI regularly can already see the ways in which certain roles will either be eliminated or completely transformed. So I think there's a lot of concern around that, and also just desire for employers to be opening up new kind of training programs, helping people shift between roles. I've been really interested in what IBM is doing from the perspective of retraining people whose jobs are most likely to be affected by AI. And just making sure that people feel like there are pathways ahead of them if their roles could eventually be eliminated. So I think people are really feeling the uncertainty and looking for what opportunities can emerge out of that.
Yeah, and part of what we've been watching, which is related, is around the lack of attrition. Basically, people are parked in their jobs right now because of the uncertainty that you're that you're talking about, and the data show that like people are not happy in their jobs. I think in some workplaces it's increasingly toxic because you have people who are anxious, don't want to make a move because it's either not possible or they don't know how, and that's not a recipe for an awesome work culture.
That's right. If you feel stuck, if you just see like my company is flattened, there are fewer chances to get promoted, there's not as many jobs open, that can be really tough.
It's really hard. Okay, we have time for maybe one or two more questions over here.
Yeah, hey, Phil Kirshner, you just started to get into the topic I was going to ask about, Emma. We heard about AI so much today. Earlier today, we were asked to provide this word cloud. Like, what are we using AI for? Writing right at the middle, and then shown a demo for how AI can like distill all this content and help. Just as journalists who write about the future work in organizations where a huge percentage, of your workforce is probably staring down the barrel of that gun more than in most companies. Like, I'm curious, what does that feel like? What are you seeing from your leadership about comfort with AI, specifically like in your world more than other industries that may be?
The New York Times is suing Microsoft and OpenAI.
I know, like, yeah. So whatever you can say, yeah.
No. Chip, do you want to start?
Yes. So for example, like reporters, I think across the journal use like AI transcription tools. So when we record every interview, you're using tools like Otter and others that just make it easy for that. We're not doing a ton in the newsroom in terms of just like how it affects our day-to-day work. So for example, the journal is experimenting with bulleted sort of summaries of articles. I think the idea is that if you give people a little bit more about what the story is about, maybe they'll get through the whole thing. Those are the first pass of those is created by AI, and then an editor approves them. So I think we're trying to be very clear about sort of where AI falls in the process. I think as reporters, we would think the idea of getting people to tell us things and reveal information and us sifting through, like, we still feel like there's a role for humans and all of that, but I don't know, I'd be curious how you think of it.
Yeah, I mean, and I tend to be like a doom and gloomer about a lot of these topics anyway, and I write a lot about workers who feel anxiety around what role AI will play in their fields. What I think makes me feel more optimistic is like researchers really emphasize that it's much more likely to be tasks that are automated rather than any, roles writ large. And so I think to a large degree, it's going to be about learning how to use these tools to our advantage and not be replaced by them, but really augment the work with them. And so I think when you look at like a lot of the, especially the sophisticated research on this that's coming out of some of the great work at MIT by David Otter and others, the emphasis really is that it's going to be tasks. It's not going to be, in a lot of cases, entire jobs being wiped out. So I think definitely there's a lot of concern in journalism, as there is in most fields, but also some optimism about figuring out how to use these tools for research.
Yeah, and Darren Acemoglu from MIT, who's been cited a few times, is among those who says the speed is likely to be much slower. I'm not sure we can count on that, but we're out of time. So thank you for your questions. Thank you for Chip, and thank you to Emma for this great conversation, and for your journalism more broadly. So thank you.